protest against the cuts. No Tory
When
cuts.
their
No
photo
Tory
call was disrupted by the same protester, the Tories argued back, while the SNP's Alex Salmond invited him for a chat in a cafe. But in Glasgow Central Station, Labour's Iain Gray had taken to his heels and headed for the exit. Mr Gray was also on the run in the STV leaders' debate when asked if the council tax would have risen if Labour had won the last election.
would be paying more.
It's possible they would also have had... Well, wait a minute. They would also have had 3,000 more teachers in their schools, 1,000 more classroom assistants, and more of the services on which many of the poorest, most vulnerable people in our families depend.
But this election isn't just won and lost in TV studios. Party troops on the ground in the constituencies are also key. Tackling knife crime, which Labour claim costs the Scottish NHS £500 million a year, is a main talking point on the doorsteps. But is their proposed mandatory 6-month sentence really mandatory?
What we mean to say is that if anyone leaves their house, their home, goes out for an evening, young or old, if they're carrying a knife across their threshold, then we want a mandatory minimum sentence applied. Courts, of course...
Of 6 months?
Yes, and courts will, of course, have a degree of latitude.
Iain Gray is competing for the top job in Scottish politics with Alex Salmond, a well-kent face, and along with playing football, he's been out and about, tasting fizzy drinks and playing guitar to get better known and spread his message that Labour's concentrating on the things that really matter, such as promising speedier cancer treatment, one of several expensive manifesto pledges.
Yes, there is some bold spending in there, but there is bold reform as well, which can allow us to release resources to protect frontline services and invest in the things we need to do to create jobs and opportunities for our young people. Nothing could be more important than that.
At the beginning of this campaign, it seemed as if the public were buying the Labour message. But with just over 2 weeks till polling day, it's neck and neck, and Iain Gray has work to do.
Well, Iain Gray joins me now. Look, before we talk about the election, just a quick reaction to this news we've had tonight about these letter bombs.
Well, it really is a shocking incident, isn't it? And we can only be grateful that nobody's been hurt, either the targets or indeed those who were handling the packages as they came through the post. I mean, I've known Trish Godman many years. She's been a great servant to the people of Renfrew, and it really is shocking. And I think we have to let the police do their job. And we have to try and keep things calm, because allowing it to spiral in any way would obviously play into the hands of the extremists who've taken this action.
All right. OK. The election.
Yes.
You're losing it, aren't you?
No, not at all. I mean, I've been in 46, I think, constituencies by now, and many of them more than once.
Tell me in the doorstep.
Many of them more than once, and the reception that the Labour message, which is, as your package showed, about jobs, about cancer waiting times, about tough action on crime, is resonating there.
Well,
and it's not just about what people say on the doorstep, but also looking at the canvass returns, and I think our message is going down well.
How do you explain the poll ratings that you've gone from? I think one poll not that long ago actually showed you might get an outright majority. OK, don't take that too seriously, but you were way out in front. Well, and now you're neck and neck.
Well, look, the poll you're referring to, you had us on, I think, 49%. I didn't take it seriously but at the time.
You would accept there has been a change. Well, I'm just interested in your explanation for why that is.
I didn't take those polls seriously at the time, and I said that I believed we were a bit ahead, but that the polls would tighten as the election came closer. And indeed, recent polls have shown us that we're in a fight. But I mean, you know, there was a poll back in February, Gordon, which showed the SNP marginally ahead. We had a poll this week which shows them slightly ahead as well. What those polls tell me is that we are in a fight for this election, and it's all to play for.
Right. Now, one of your flagship policies, knife crime.
Well, our absolute flagship policy, I would say, because, you know, I do think this is the...
You're going to tell me that the economy, yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, well, that's what the voters would say too, Gordon, I think.
Knife crime. As I understand it, what you're saying is that if someone is convicted of carrying a knife, they go to jail, that's it. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's the case?
If they're convicted of carrying a knife.
Right.
Yes. And currently... so that's a conviction in the same way as convictions take place.
Right.
Now, and those who've tried to say that
So what Andy Kerr said in that clip you saw there, when he said the courts had a degree of latitude, and he hasn't quite understood the policy, right?
No, what the policy says is that if there were extreme mitigating circumstances, it would be possible with an explanation not to impose the mandatory sentence, but those would be very unusual circumstances.
So for example, let's think of a rather obvious thing. Let's say you have a woman who's been severely abused by her husband, runs out into the street after him, and maybe even uses a knife on him. One might expect the courts to take the view that this woman had been so abused that it would not be reasonable to send her to jail. She would or wouldn't be sent to jail.
Well, that would be something that the court would decide, and there would be, in extreme mitigating circumstances, some latitude. But look,
so in fact, you've invented a new concept of discretionary mandatory sentencing.
No, not at all.
Yes, you have.
No, not at all.
Yes, you just said you have.
The position at the moment, Gordon, the position at the moment is that of those who are convicted of carrying a knife, and those who try to say that this policy is about people carrying pruning knives or skiing doos in their socks are really just missing the point altogether. Those who are convicted of carrying a knife... I'm accepting
your point about conviction, but you're saying the courts will have some latitude. You're saying what Andy Kerr said.
Those who are convicted of
carrying a knife...
So they're not
mandatory policies by definition.
Currently 70% of those convicted of carrying a knife don't go to jail. The people of Scotland don't believe that that's right. I don't believe that it's right. And that's the situation which we want to change.
So your message to judges is they will still have the right to say, no, OK, it's a mandatory sentence, but it's a discretionary mandatory sentence, so we won't send them to jail.
Only in the most extreme mitigating circumstances, and they would have to explain what that reason was.
Right.
But I would expect to see pretty well all of those convicted of carrying a knife going to jail, instead of 70% of them.
So you want more
people
people sent to jail. It's not actually a mandatory sentence.
Actually, what I want is to deter people from carrying a knife. And indeed, that's what the 30,000 people who signed our petition supporting this policy want to see as well.
Right. Now, the financing of this idea that somehow or other knife crime costs the NHS in Scotland £500 million. Where did you get that from?
Well, the £500 million figure isn't our figure. It came from two reports from the Violence Reduction Unit. It's been widely reported. There was a similar report from Medics Against Violence, one of their founder members. It's a figure that they used.
But this policy...
Well,
the document last night from the Violence Reduction Unit, the 500 million figure, which they do mention in there, they were talking about all crimes of violence. They weren't talking about knife crime.
I think if you look at the quote from the founder of Medics Against Violence, she talks specifically about knife crime. But look, Gordon, this is a policy not driven by cost. It is a policy not to save money, but a policy to save lives. Far too many Scots still lose their lives to knife crime.
But the basic point is if you can't back figures up, don't quote them. It was perfectly, you could perfectly reasonably say, oh, it doesn't cost any money at all, but we still think it's wrong.
No. The basic point, Gordon, is why are we pursuing this policy? We pursue this policy to try and deter Scots from carrying knives, and by doing that, to save lives. We're still in a circumstance where almost half the murders committed in Scotland are committed with a knife. And the murder rate, indeed, in the last year, as we saw recently, has gone up by 30%. So far too many Scots still lose their lives to knife crime. That's what drives this policy. That and the campaign which has been run by people like John Muir and Kelly McGee, who lost family members to knife crime. That's why Labour say it should be the case that if you're convicted of carrying a knife, you should go to jail.
Right, but you don't actually know how much it costs the NHS.
Well, we've quoted the figures. The figures come from the Violence Reduction Unit.
No, they don't. The Violence Reduction Unit report is talking about all crimes of violence. And in fact, in their chapter on the financing of this, the first sentence says you can't put a specific figure on it.
But Gordon, this is a widely reported figure. This is a widely reported figure. It is not the basis of this policy. The basis of this policy is to save lives in Scotland, stop Scots carrying knives, and reduce the cost of knife crime in human lives. That's its purpose. That's its purpose.
Okay.
And that's why so many people in Scotland support it.
You want a Scottish minimum wage, £7.15 an hour, in the public sector?
Well, we support the living wage campaign, £7.15 an hour in the public sector, but we also want to create a living wage commission, which would then work with the public sector to use procurement and contracts to then spread that out from the public sector into the private sector.
So the idea would be that a private company that wants to tender has to pay the living wage.
Yes.
Right. And that's legal, is it?
Yes.
It is legal?
Yes.
And you've had legal advice on that?
Yes, it is legal to set requirements on companies who are bidding for contracts. London,
oh, is it?
London is already a living wage city. Glasgow is a living wage city as well. And this is the way, through partnership, that
right,
we
so
work
if a company loses
out.
a contract and says, look, we're paying the UK minimum wage, which is the legal requirement, and we lost a contract because we're not paying your living wage, they would have no basis for taking court action.
It is one of the criteria which can be used in the tendering process, as can other things, Gordon, like providing apprenticeship opportunities, or indeed the procurement process could be used too, in order to put work towards sheltered workshops, so that we wouldn't see things like we've seen in Edinburgh, where a sheltered workshop that's been there for 280 years is closed.
All right. Nuclear power. In the light of what's happened at Fukushima, would you, were you First Minister, ever contemplate using the planning laws in Scotland to allow the construction of a nuclear reactor?
Well, we've said quite clearly that we believe we need a mix of electricity generation, and that it's wrong to have a presumption against an application, and
so
that's the position that we would take. It would be considered on its merits, yes, but within that, of course, you would have to take account primarily of safety and any recommendations, any changes which come out of the,
so just
analysis of Fukushima. Well, let me finish. It's not a simple question, so let me finish the answer. Of course, that would have to take account of any changes in nuclear safety which come out of the Fukushima incident. The fact of the matter, of course, is that there are no live planning applications currently before the Scottish Government, which isn't surprising, because
but
of the
Fukushima has
presumption they've
not
had
led
against
you to
it.
change your views?
Well, look, we have to have a mix of electricity generation. We need to have baseload electricity. The fact of the matter is that, as of tonight, around 30% of our electricity is generated by our 2 nuclear stations, and that will continue to be the case for the future, Gordon.
Yeah, we know that. We're talking about whether you would... now, look, one of the...
and that's a position, actually, by the way,